right. Good afternoon and happy Friday, everyone. Welcome to the next installment of PNACAC's Happy Hour webinar series, Telling Unique Stories After COVID-19. My name is Erin Jensen. I am the former Technology Committee Chair for PNACAC. I am joined behind the scenes by Stephanie Beamer, our newly minted Technology Committee Chair for PNACAC, and Max Hamburger, our Communications Committee Chair. Next, we want to give you a bit of housekeeping. So we will keep the chat feature closed today, but we welcome you to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask questions anytime during the presentation. We'll do our best to address your questions live at the conclusion of the webinar, and if we can't get to all of them, we will follow up with you directly afterwards. Additionally, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our YouTube channel by Monday morning. All attendees will receive a notification by email once it's been posted online. So now, without further ado, I am very pleased to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, Carter Osborne, owner of Carter Osborne Tutoring. Through his work, he provides end-to-end writing instruction for college applicants in the greater Seattle area, including high school students, transfer students, and community college students. He specializes in student-led instruction, providing guidance and scaffolding while empowering students to drive their own writing process. He hails from our very own Pacific Northwest, though he took a short jaunt to California to earn a bachelor's degree from Stanford, then returned to Washington for his master's degree. Thank you, Carter, for sharing this information with us today. Feel free to take it away.
And thank you, Erin, and thanks to the rest of your team as well for putting this presentation together. I know it couldn't have been easy to convert what was supposed to be an in-person format into this virtual format, but your team has been doing an incredible job. So just want to give you a shout out for that. Hello, everyone tuning in here. I hope everyone tuning in is staying safe, staying well. I hope you're at least trying to enjoy lockdown a little bit. It's funny, at the beginning of this whole thing, right when we went into lockdown, I remember calling my mom to just talk through it. And I said, oh, what do you think is going to happen? She said, I don't know. What are you going to do to keep busy? We have so much free time. And I said, I don't know. I think I might start running more. I don't know. I'll play some music. And she said, that's interesting. That's interesting. I feel like you're missing just one key item off that list, just one thing. And I said, and I will use my time to call home more, don't worry. And she said, oh, will you? You don't have to do that. Wow. So my mom is at least trying to enjoy lockdown, and I think she's being a little more successful with that than I am. So want to get into the content. My name is Carter Osborne. I am the owner of the uncreatively named Carter Osborne Tutoring. I'm a college application coach based in Seattle, and specifically, I'm a college essay coach. So all the writing components of college applications, the personal statement, the supplemental essays, that's what I specialize in. I work with students primarily in Seattle, although now with Zoom becoming more and more common, I'm starting to work with students all over the country. So, as you can imagine, I want to talk with you all today about the college essay process, specifically before and after coronavirus and how it's changed the situation. All right, let's get into it. I always like to start with a little fun story or comic, so here's my comic for you. A lot of you tuning in are probably guidance counselors, so I'm sorry if this is anxiety provoking. I know it was for me seeing it, although frankly, this is the one that I related to a little bit more. Doc, I'm just here to find a topic for my college essay. This really can be what it feels like sometimes. Actually, the part about this comic that I found funny when I pulled it up was how distressed the psychologist looks in this. And I was like, oh, that's no good. I relate to that somehow. But hopefully we can talk about some strategies so that you and I don't end up like the cartoon psychologist here. Okay, let's go ahead and get into it. To answer your question that I know you're all wondering about, yes, obviously COVID-19 has completely changed the game when it comes to college essays. That said, I want to make one thing very clear. This will be kind of my big takeaway for the entire presentation. I hope that you can see this more clearly by the time we get to the end. Yeah, coronavirus has changed things, but it hasn't changed the fundamentals of what makes a good college essay, right? There are still foundational principles that we need to follow that apply this year, just like they applied last year and the year before. Coronavirus has fundamentally changed the environment that those principles are applied to. They've changed the topics that kids are going to write about. But I think those core principles still hold. In fact, I think they're more important than ever. So the first half of this presentation is going to be about those core principles. Hopefully, if it's not brand new for you, it'll be at least a nice refresher. And then the second half, I want to talk about how coronavirus itself has switched things up. So before I dive in, I want to give a brief disclaimer here. This is usually not the kind of presentation format I would like. I'm a very sort of in-person audience interactive kind of person. So frankly, it kind of feels like I'm shouting into the void right now. So if you all want to shout back every now and then, I'm not just encourage you, I am kind of begging you to use the Q&A feature, to use the chat, throw something back at me. There are a couple of slides in the middle of this where I'll just break for questions so that we can talk through what we're going through. I really don't think I can make it through this entire thing on my own, so please help me out. All right, let's get into it. In my opinion, okay, this is wildly overgeneralized, but for the sake of this presentation and showing the importance of college essays, there's four main parts to any big college app: your academics, your GPA, your coursework rigor, all that kind of stuff, your test scores, your letters of recommendation, and then the part that I specialize in, essays, activity statements, personal statements, right? Anything that involves writing new content. So the question is, how are these things going to change after coronavirus? In my opinion, the fundamental pieces themselves aren't going to be any different. What's going to change is the relative weight of each of them in an application process, right? Now, many of you are college counselors, many of you are admissions counselors, so I'm sure you have your own view on this. I hope you'll take this not as an objective truth, but rather as my opinion based on my experience, the guidance counselors I've talked to, the admissions counselors I've talked to. So, in my opinion, here's what I think is going to start happening as we move towards the 2020-2021 application cycle. So academics, kind of a mess right now, as many of you know, in terms of transcripts, GPA, with every school district and every state choosing their own ways to count grades during this, whether you're going to give all your students all A's or make sure their GPA doesn't fall below a certain level. It's a bit of a mess. So it's unclear what colleges are really going to do to use GPA and factor into the admissions decision. What we can say is that test scores are taking a big hit here. You all have probably seen the news by now that the UC system is going to buck the SAT and the ACT. Call me biased as a writing tutor, but I was actually pretty pumped about that news. I think this is really the continuation of a longer trend. If I were working at the College Board right now, I would be shaking in my boots a little bit because I think test scores are slowly going to be phasing out. And this year might be one of those big years where admissions counselors say, yeah, we'll use this as a light barometer, but nowhere near the same, give it the same weight as we used to. So those quantitative metrics are probably going to be either the same or less important. So what's going to take their place in the levels of importance? Well, it's the qualitative metrics: letters of recommendation, unfortunately for Timmy, and essays and activities, college essays, right? So this is me stoking my own ego a little bit, but it's like, yeah, college essays could be a lot more important this year than they have been in the past. So we need to take them seriously. All right, like I said, I want to walk you through the foundational principles that I think go into a good essay. This is how I work with students. I'm basically just going to break down my process that I use for most of the students I work with to talk about how to move an essay from idea to final polished draft with as little hassle and hair pulling as possible. And primarily, I want to focus on the personal statement, not because supplemental essays aren't important, but I think students' academic experience lends itself a little bit better to supplemental essays. They're usually more straightforward. They're written in a more straightforward way. They're shorter. So students tend to be able to tackle those. What's daunting to an existentially distressing level for most kids is to look at a blank white sheet of paper with a list of 7 prompts, all of which are very vague, and say, what do I write about to show myself on the page? So this is usually what I talk to people about when I make presentations on college essays. All right, let's break it down. For me, there's 4 main components. Again, this is probably a review for all of you, but hopefully it's a good refresher. There's the brainstorming phase. There's getting a first draft, whether it's good or bad. There's revising the heck out of it. And then finally, a key writing principle: you put your work down, go live your life, come back to it like a week later, and then polish it up. All right, I'll try to briefly go through each of these steps, even though I've never been brief in my life, and see what we can do here. Okay, so on all these slides, I'm going to put my main takeaway at the top just so that you know where I'm going, and then I'll kind of describe the detail down below. And by the way, I believe these slides will be made available to you all after this presentation, so I know that obviously you'll want to furiously take notes for all of the incredible content I'm sending your way, but don't worry about it. They'll be made available to you. So first stage of the personal statement, and really of any essay, is brainstorming. Here's my sort of tip, or at least my strategy that I use with students, is to use conversational brainstorming. conversational brainstorming that matches a student's learning style, right? So what do I mean by that? This is one of my biggest pet peeves, and I've been guilty of it in the past, right? When a student comes in and they say, oh, I'm thinking of writing my personal statement, what's the first thing we all do? We turn to the college app website or the Common App website and say, that's great. Here's this list of 7 prompts. Why don't you look at them and see if anything comes up? The reason I don't do that anymore, and I implore you all not to use that as your first step, is because personally, I think that when you show a student a list of prompts, they get into their sort of like academic student brain and they go, oh, I have to write an essay based on a prompt. How do I get an A? How do I do this right? What's the right answer, right? And that's not to blame the student. This is how we train them in academic settings, by and large. We say, here's your prompt. I'm going to give you a letter grade at the end of this. Write your essay formulaically. When you're trying to come up with a creative topic in a brainstorming session, that kind of tightening up, that kind of stress is toxic to the brainstorming process. So instead, I encourage you to hold off on those prompts unless they really can't get anywhere. And instead, try to have a genuine conversation about the experiences and the talents and the interests that the students have, right? So for example, literally 3 days ago, I was meeting with a student for the first time, a new student, and we had to select her personal essay topic, and we got one within about half an hour. And it started off as a casual conversation. I simply said, what are your interests? And she said, oh, I don't know. I like school. I like my art class. And I was like, oh, you're in art. That's cool. Are you an artist? And she said, kind of. Yeah, I really like doing a lot of different kinds of art, right? All right. This is a decision point where you can say, oh, that's great. Let's come to a Common App prompt and kind of find which one your art might fit into. Or you can actually keep talking to them and figure out what's going on along the way, dig into her experience a little bit more. So I said, that's interesting. What kind of art do you like? She said, I'm a painter. I really like watercolors. I said, okay, that's really cool. As someone who's not an artist, I'm fascinated by why you like watercolors so much and not necessarily something like drawing, right? This is what I call a comparative question. It's a pretty simple technique where you say, that's interesting. I don't know very much about this. Why do you like this thing, but not this other very similar thing? That forces students to really drill into their interest and pick out why they like that specifically. It basically forces them to think deeper. So you use a comparative question and say, all right, what is it about watercolors that you like so much? Why that and not a similar form of art? And she said, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's just like very freeing in a way. You know, watercolors, you can mix your own colors, but also when I'm painting, you know, they run everywhere or they'll go somewhere I don't predict them that they'll go. You know, it's sort of unpredictable. And I don't know, that feels stressful to say, but I actually kind of like it. It's kind of fun. Okay, so I say, that's interesting. That's really interesting. Out of curiosity, this is going to sound like a weird question, but is there any other part of your life where you feel like, yeah, there's a lot of ambiguity and sometimes things run together in ways that you don't expect them to, but instead of being stressed out by that, you actually like that? And she kind of paused and she goes, you know, now that you say it, yeah, I feel like that happens all the time. I don't know. I feel like ambiguity for me, it's not stressful. It's kind of the thing that makes me more creative and more, you know, innovative with the ways I think. Okay. Boom, right? Boom, that's money. For me as an essay tutor, I'm like, this is great, right? We can just run from here. You start getting examples in her life and like whatever. But that's her main topic, how watercoloring can be a metaphor for other ways that she approaches life and how she can use ambiguity to her own creative advantage. Kind of a neat topic. The only reason it happened is because we never went to one of those pre-made prompts where she would have been like, I don't know, I like watercolors, but how does that apply to prompt number 4? Instead, we just have a conversation and then you can apply it to one of the prompts or frankly, just go to the last prompt, which is tell a story of your own. Okay, I'm taking way too long. I'm going to keep moving here. This is one of the things that students say is the most helpful when I'm working with them, that I will just take out a notepad and jot down stuff that they say, right? I'm not even really jotting it down into an essay format necessarily. It's really just kind of grouping like ideas, but I really encourage you to do this just casually. And when a student sees that you're writing down their thoughts, they can actually focus on like really brainstorming things and not having to remember what they're saying. They're not having to write it down, which feels too formal. It just lets them think more freely. So I encourage you to write outlines. And then when you're done, just tear the paper off and give it to them. That'll help them get through their first draft, which as I'm about to mention, is oftentimes the hardest part of this entire process. Okay, you all probably know these, so this is a lot of review, but free writing is always a great way for students to go at home and brainstorm their essay topics. I think that audio journaling is woefully underutilized, both by students and by counselors prescribing methods for students to think up topics. This is how I thought of my personal statement topic. Clearly, I love to talk to the detriment of anyone who knows me. So I'm one of these people where I think by talking. I have to talk my thoughts out in order to create more and more creative thoughts. So audio recording is great. For students that who really like this, extroverts or a lot of students who do theater really like this because they're used to talking in their creative mindset, I would literally say, pull your phone out, hit record, and then just start talking for 10, 15, 20 minutes. I don't even care what it is. And, in the inevitable word soup that comes out of your mouth, there might be one or two really good ideas in there that you can pull and then start exploring for your college essay. That's what happened with me. I've used it with several of my students to great success. So I encourage you to think about, okay, is this the kind of student who likes to sit in silence and write? Or are they the kind of student who does better when they're actually talking? Maybe they do better with an audio journal. And then finally, there's some interesting research coming out lately that students, and actually every one of us, we are more creative and more innovative when we are in the act of doing something that we find highly stimulating, right? So for example, if you're a runner, when you're on a long run, you actually can start to think a lot more creatively than you can when you're just sitting in stasis. If you're a musician, when you're listening to music or playing music, that can activate some really nice creative parts of your brain. So it's an interesting exercise to say to someone who's, say, a runner, next time you go on your long run, just maybe have the idea about your college essay topic floating in the back of your mind and see what happens. I think you'd be surprised by the number of topics that students can come up with. I've certainly used this to a lot of success. So I encourage you all to think about that. All right. Oh boy. I told myself that I would be brief in this section, even though I've never been brief in my life. So I'm going to start hurrying through some of this a little bit. All right. The tyranny of the first draft. This is classic, right? You all know this intimately, I'm sure, both by working with students and by your own sort of anxiety-provoking struggles with a blank white page, right? Here's my takeaway. There's two factors in writing. There's your ability, and then there's your expectations for your own writing. I encourage you to promote students' ability to write. Say, hey, you're a good writer, do your best. But also for a first draft, lower those expectations down, right? This is my favorite piece of advice to give because students oftentimes struggle with their expectations being too high. And when you think about it, we've set them up for this, right? There's a lot of pressure. There's years worth of pressure when you're working up to your college applications, especially those essays. There's general performance anxiety. And then there's the cardinal sin that we all commit, which is when a student walks in and says, I'm thinking of writing my college essay, we say, oh, that's great. Let me show you these examples that are like the best of the best examples I've ever seen. These stunning, shining things, which is inspirational, I suppose. The problem is that we don't show the kids what those essays looked like when they were in stage one, right? The like ugly, messed up version of them before they were polished and revised. So for a student, you don't know anything about college apps. You've never written a college essay before. And then you see a bunch of really shining examples. You're going to get the idea in your mind that if you write anything less than that, it's not good enough. And that's when students start panicking. This is when they call me, at like 1 a.m, because that's when they're up. And they say, oh my gosh, I've written like 2 sentences, but it's not good enough. So I'm just going to give up. I'm not going to college, And I'm like, all right, let's settle down. It's going to be fine. Here's what I always tell them. You have a writing ability that you're working up to, right? You're doing your absolute best. I can see that, right? And I applaud you for doing it. The problem is your expectations are way up here. That gap is really distressing, right? That's one of those things where you go, oh, I'm a terrible writer. I'm never going to be good enough. I'm never going to get into the college I want to go to. These spiraling thoughts start, and soon enough, you're frozen, right? For students, I always say, you know what? You've stressed out about your writing ability enough. Do the best you can. And as soon as you top out, just lower your expectations, right? I love giving this advice. This is the one time as a writing tutor where I can look at a student and be like, be lazier, right? Stop holding yourself to such a high standard. It's going to be fine. If you think a sentence is crummy, great. Me too. Let's just get it on the page and we'll come back to it later. And then, in the future, we can have a good laugh about how bad that first draft was. Isn't that so fun? Because first drafts are never good. We all know this, right? Literally a week ago, I wrote something at work and it was a first draft and it was actually kind of good. And I almost popped a bottle of champagne. It was like this amazing experience because that never happens. They're always bad. And that's okay. You have to embrace the bad in order to get to the good. All right. I couldn't do this without leaving you with a cliche quote, right? So to become a proper writer, you have to forgive yourself the catastrophe of the first draft. That's the right word for it, the catastrophe of the first draft. I think we could go a long way towards encouraging students to say, these are the examples that you see, but understand that they all started in their own version of catastrophe, as yours will and as everyone's will. That's okay. Just get it down on the page and we'll keep moving later. All right, stage number 3, everyone's favorite, revision, revision, revision. My main takeaway for this is that you should really try to isolate the types of revision that you point students towards. And here's what I mean. When we get to this stage, 95% of people say, great, you have your draft, you've kind of touched it up a little bit, let's revise. Go for it, go home and revise. Or like, here's some things I've seen, go home and pick it apart. The problem is for a lot of students, this is a brand new style of writing and they don't know where to start. So all of a sudden you're telling them to just revise, but there's so many different types of revision. And when you tell students to do it all at once, it's overwhelming. And that can lead to freezing, that can lead to students tearing their essay apart unnecessarily, right? They're basically taking a stab in the dark. So let's help them along the way. For me, I see kind of 3 main levels of revision, which is oversimplified, but it's generally how you can treat it. There's the high level, which we all know. It's really talking about the focus of the story itself, the order of the paragraphs, right? The content, it's all this big stuff. That's where I would encourage you to start. Say, okay, take this essay home and just look at your order of paragraphs, or just look at your main point, right? I don't care about the sentences. I don't care if they're beautiful. I don't care about the order of the paragraphs yet. I just want you to really talk about that highest level stuff. I'll spend a whole week with students on just this level of revision, and then we'll move on, right? So let's say you do that. They go home, they clean it up. It's beautiful. It's incredible. It's going to win them a Pulitzer. All right. Level 2, this mid-level sentence. This for me is when a student would come back, we'd review what they did, and then I would say, this is great. Okay, we're gonna move on to this mid-level, and I want you to forget all about high-level revisions, all right? They don't exist. You don't care about them anymore, right? We're moving straight to mid-level, and it's all I want you to look at. This is within paragraph changes. So your topic is locked, your paragraphs are locked in place. But let's talk about how to move sentences around within a paragraph. Maybe you can add some visual detail, smooth your transition sentences over, right? It's that kind of medium level stuff, right? But they're not paying attention to the high level stuff yet. So we'll spend half a week on that, give or take. And then you get to the small scale. This is clarifying sentences, inserting some beautifying language, cutting unnecessary language. That's the bigger one, actually, that I should have included in this list. The key is that when you say revise to a student, that's usually where they start. They'll say, oh, okay, I'll clean up my sentences. That's what revision is. That's not revision, that's editing. That comes later, right? So when you get to this small scale, you're not thinking about mid or high level anymore. You're thinking only about that small stuff to clean up the language in the essay. And then when you're all done, we can look at all 3 pieces together, and that's a little bit better to chew on, right? Because we've broken it down into pieces. This is what I encourage you to break it down to with your students. Otherwise, it's just too much all at once. Finally, classic writing advice, right? Put the thing down, step away from the essay, right? As if it is radioactive. I cannot tell you how important this is. I say a week. Frankly, you could do more if you wanted to. A lot of students who I work with over the summertime will complete their personal statement, put it down in like August, and then revisit it in late October, right? Like right before they submit for the early application deadline. So that's a month and a half. But then they open it back up and all of a sudden you see all these things you couldn't see before. Not to mention they've become a better writer during that time too. So put the revised draft down. In the meantime, if they're agonizing about not having something to do, say, fine, well, start outlining those supplementals or work on your activity list, right? This is the beauty of the college app process. There's always more stuff to do, as you all know far too well, I'm sure. So that you can occupy them with other things. My one point of caution would be that it's not uncommon to have students put their essay down for a couple of weeks, come back to it, and they're like embroiled in this existential crisis. They come back and they're like, well, I took this time off, and in that time I decided that I'm actually going to write about this totally different idea. Is that okay? To which I say, no. I mean, like, it's fine. If you have a great idea, let's use it for a supplemental essay. That's okay. But you got a great essay here. I wouldn't have let you come down this far if you had a bad essay, right? You've got a good essay. It's cleaned up. So tough cookies. If you like that idea, use it for something else. But right now, let's just talk about polishing. So to go back to our list of 3 before, when they come back after that break, I encourage you to only look at this small scale stuff, right? Maybe 1 or 2 mid-level things, but keep it small scale. Otherwise, they're going to start freaking out about whether they chose the right topic, and that's never the right direction to go this late in the essay stage. Whew. All right. I told you all that I was going to talk a lot. I love talking, unfortunately. Okay, question break. Go ahead and input some Q&A, input something in the chat, please, or I'm going to go absolutely nuts over here. I promise I will. Okay, I'm going to give it like 20 seconds. See if I can stay quiet that long.
No need to stay quiet, Carter. We have
All
one
right,
question already.
good.
Um, David is asking, do you think there's any validity to the procrastinator and last minute pressure type who claims to work better at the end game,
Mm.
not those planners?
Oh, that's a great question. It's funny. So I'm a planner. My absolute best friend is a procrastinator, and she's incredible. She's one of the best writers I've ever met in my life. But it all happens furiously at like 11 p.m. When there's a midnight deadline. The thing is, I actually think that some kids really are like this. I mean, I don't know that life very well. I just get stressed and then can't perform. But some people do produce incredible work under the pressure of a deadline. The problem with college apps is that the risk is so high. You wouldn't want to push this deadline too late because it's such a high risk scenario. And moreover, I think a lot of kids like to identify as the last minute pressure kids, but they aren't actually, right? They just kind of think they are. They want to be one, so they'll say they are. So my general advice is I'm going to institute like artificial deadlines along the way and be pretty strict about them. So as a tutor, I always come to students and I'm like, all right, next week, next Wednesday, I need you to have this first draft ready. I mean, it needs to be fully done. There's no copping out, right? So I don't know. It's a little bit artificial. It doesn't carry quite the same stress and pressure, but if you put enough weight on it, you can motivate those really last minute kids to get their work done, even though it's ahead of time. And I don't know, maybe it helps them along the way. I wouldn't encourage anyone to wait until the last minute on a college app, though. It's just too risky, in my opinion, even if that's your natural writing style. At a certain point, you kind of have to turn to them and say, I'm sorry, but you're just gonna have to tough it out and start planning a little earlier.
Great, thank you. Our next question is from Elisa. Do these techniques work in small groups? Have you had success doing a workshop?
That's really interesting. So I'll admit that this is my weakness. I've worked in camps and workshops over the summertime, but it's not my main method. So I think that they can, and I've certainly been a part of camps where the students will do group revision, but focus on some of those techniques, right? So you do group revision, but they say, okay, everybody take another person's essay and only look for those high level things or only look for those mid level things. That can definitely work. I don't see why they can't. I'll admit though that my strength is individual conversation, and I think the most challenging part of this is the brainstorming phase, right? That conversational technique that I was mentioning kind of relies on a one-on-one situation so that you can dig into a person's unique story a little bit. That's kind of tough when you have a whole group and you're breaking students out to talk to each other or you're trying to talk to all of them. It's challenging. The thing that I would encourage you to do is simply have students pair up with each other and sort of recreate those one-on-one conversations where you say, hey, I know that you're not necessarily master interviewers, but frankly, just be extremely curious about what the other person is saying with their interests and keep digging into what they're talking about. Ask the classic, like, why 3 times thing, where you ask why over and over again until someone has to explain the core of their idea. Something like that, right? Or you have a small group 5 and 4 people are all questioning one person to try to dig into their topic. It's not perfect. There's probably a smoother translation, but that to me is one of those things where it's better in a one-on-one setting, but I think it can be applied in a small group setting with some creative techniques.
Great, thank you.
Cool.
Those are all the questions we have for now.
All right, I will move on. And like I said, please contribute to the Q&A. I'm going to go nuts over here. All right, you all knew this was coming in a cliche fashion. You can't talk about college essays without talking about cliches. So this is one of my favorite quotes. It's a cliche that most cliches are true, but like most cliches, that cliche is untrue. All right. I actually want to start this whole section with a little game that obviously you're not going to actually participate in, but that's fine. I'll play it on my own. Going to give you a bunch of topics, and you have to tell me, is it cliche or not? I know, super original, but I promise it'll be kind of fun. And let me give one disclaimer before I begin this whole thing. I'm not saying that students can't write about cliche topics, right? And I'm actually have a whole bit on this later on in the presentation where I talk about converting cliche topics into unique stories, how you can use them to your advantage. For now, this is kind of assuming that a student writes this sort of like bland, middle of the road, heard it 100 times style of the topic that's on the left side of this chart, right? So assuming that students don't get super creative with it. Sports, is it cliche? Absolutely. I swear, if y'all are going to relate to this. If I read another essay that's like, oh, we lost the state championship, but that's when I learned that it's not about winning, it's about the person you become along the way, right? It's like, oh, gag me. Like, this is just too much. Please stop, right? And you see 100 of these every year. It's the classic thing. Sports are the ultimate cliche. So let's stay away from them. Mission trips are another one, right? Every year there's 101 essays from kids who go to, build some house in a developing country, and then they come back and they say, wow, that perspective change made me realize that I'm so fortunate to live in the US. And it's like, all right, let's move on. This is really, it's giving me some weird vibes right now. Getting your first B, the bane of high achieving students everywhere. They think their life is over when in fact it's fine. Family vacations, please don't, right? This is a one-way ticket to privileged land for your essay. I really encourage these people to stay away from this. Community service, ostensibly not that bad. Although frankly, 95% of kids who write about it go with the lens of, I thought I was helping them, but it turns out they were actually helping me the whole time. To which I say, they obviously weren't, because if they were really helping you, you would know that this is not a good college essay topic. So let's move on, please. Okay, the person I most admire essay, no thank you. This is not an essay about Abe Lincoln, it's about you. And then finally, my favorite. I've actually gotten several of these. I went through a breakup and it taught me how hard life truly is. I'm sorry, kids. Whenever this happens, I have to look at them and tactfully say, this is a wonderful journal entry. It is not for your college essay. I'm sorry, that's just what it is. Okay, classic cliches. There's probably many, many more that I could have thrown on the list. This is just a few. I do, however, want to go over some unexpected or surprising cliches that have come up in recent years that I want to flag for you all in case you see them. You've probably seen these coming across your desks. So mental health, mainly talking about anxiety and depression, surprisingly has become very, very common in the last, I would just say 3 or 4 years, right? So full disclosure, I actually think that this is great. From a societal standpoint, I'm happy about the fact that young people are comfortable enough talking about their mental health that they're willing to write their college essay about it. I think that's a great transition. Unfortunately, it's becoming so common that it's almost cliche in college essays. So I don't encourage you to point kids away from that. But I do encourage you to ask them to diversify a little bit, right? If it's going to be anxiety, yeah, talk about the source of it. But a lot of kids write about how school pressure makes them anxious, right? And it's like, okay, well, we hear that a lot. Let's kind of diversify away from that a little bit. Okay. Acknowledging privilege is the next one. This kind of goes back to that mission trip example, right? The short story here is that it's not enough to acknowledge your privilege. You have to acknowledge it and then say, what am I going to do about it? How has this changed the person I am, or the values I hold, or the interests that I pursue, right? This is really common among progressive areas like Seattle or Portland or Vancouver. Students come in and they say, oh, I acknowledge that I benefit from white privilege, and that's a big and unfortunate and part of society that we need to change. We need to dramatically change. To which I say, that's great, but the whole point of that is that any person who identifies as white could write this essay. What about you? How has this changed your values or the way that you're going to interact with the world? Are you going to study something different in college now because of your awareness of this, right? Let's just dig into a level deeper. And then finally, you probably have seen this a lot. I know I see it a lot. The creative essay that is creative because there's actually not a whole lot of substance behind it. So they're trying to cover it up, right? For me, this is a lot like if a magician went up and had a bunch of crazy smoke and lights and mirrors, and then the big moment comes and no rabbit comes out of the hat, right? Which leaves me sitting there going like, well, now I'm more disappointed, right? Because you did like the whole thing, you did the whole lead up, but there's no substance behind it. Creativity is great, but it needs to be a frame for solid content first. Okay, those are just some flags. Again, I'm sure there's many more we could put on here, but when you see essays coming across your desk, just keep these in mind. All right, the last new cliches I'll introduce to you before we start getting to strategies. Cliches for the 2020 and 2021 application cycle. Here we go, same game. Are you ready? It's gonna be great. There's a lot we can say. Obviously, a lot of nuance and complication here. So I wanna just go through one at a time, and we'll talk about whether it's cliche and why. So let me just start with the first row. Oh, would you look at that? There's only one. It is just COVID all the time, forever. There's going to be, you all know this, there's going to be like 5 million COVID essays. I don't even think there's 5 million kids graduating this year, but somehow there will be 5 million COVID essays, right? They're just going to be everywhere. So we have to be prepared. Right. It's actually interesting, though. I will say in the last few weeks, as I've been onboarding students, I've been running into a lot of students and parents who say, oh, we think everyone is going to write a coronavirus essay, so I don't want to write one. That was interesting. I didn't expect a lot of people to say that. And we'll see to what extent that actually takes hold, how many people actually choose to avoid coronavirus because they're seeing the cliche coming. I think it's safe to say, though, that there's going to be a lot. There's going to be a lot of coronavirus-related essays, regardless of whether people take up that mindset or not. So we have to be prepared. Okay, so how to help students deal with cliches and get around them. Before I begin this, Aaron, I saw some questions floating in. If they're backing up, I'm certainly happy to pause and take a few of them before we get into this section. Are there enough for us to stop and talk through some things?
Yeah, and actually we have two comments that I think would be great to tie into what you had mentioned in some
Yeah.
of those previous slides. One of the comments is from Christopher, not a question but an observation. When
Mhm.
Christopher was a reader for UCSB, they counted one year how many mission trip / Habitat for Humanity essays they
I'm
had.
excited for this.
It
Yeah.
was 33% of the total out of over 60,000 unique apps.
Wow.
So just a little bit of commentary
My
there. And then
goodness.
we also had some commentary from Courtney that this year, one of the cliches was quote unquote, overcoming adversity.
Classic, right? My
Yeah.
favorite, yeah, yeah. My favorite is the overcoming adversity essay where they don't really even say what the adversity is. They just talk like, yeah, I'm overcoming somehow, some way over some challenge, but I promise I am. And you're like, okay, let's just move on, please. Um, yeah, go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah. And then the last question or the last mention that came in that I think is what you're about to talk about. So that's great. And I'm hoping this is what other folks are here to learn more about. From Anne, the pandemic has impacted us all in so many powerful ways and it
Yes,
can't be ignored. How do
yes.
students handle the COVID essay prompt as a separate topic without overwhelming colleges and being unique?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I have a whole slide on that coming up. So I hope it'll answer your question. Thank you for those of you who fielded comments and questions. I really appreciate that. So yeah, look forward to that coronavirus conversation coming up. And I actually think it's the next slide. So general advice for getting around cliches, at least that I've experienced, and this can absolutely apply to coronavirus themed essays coming up. The main problem is that our instinct for cliches is to run away. The classic advice is don't use cliches, right? That's exactly the opposite of what I think we should do. The problem is that students have really unique stories buried within cliche topics, right? Part of the reason cliche topics are cliche is because they are inherently compelling, right? I'll be honest, I love sports and I find them very compelling, even though I've read the same storylines over and over again. There's a reason people write about sports, they're powerful. The problem is they say the same thing, but we can't just run away from them. If there's a unique story buried in there, we have to dig it out a little bit. Case in point, let me just check the time. Yeah, all right. Case in point, a year ago, actually about 2 years ago now, I was working with a student who came in late. We only had a week to write an essay, his whole personal statement from the ground up, and he wanted to write about football. I said, what do you want to write about? He goes, football. And I go, okay, timeout. First of all, you can't write about sports. Second of all, if you're gonna write about sports, you can't write about football. That's the one that you just can't do, you know? So this is Carter 1.0, right? I'm a fairly new tutor. I was just working in this and I said, I'm sorry, you can't write about football. We just have to pick another topic. It's too cliche. He said, okay, okay, okay. So we start talking through other topic ideas. We talk through academics. We talk through extracurriculars, volunteering, community service. We talked about a mission trip, unfortunately, right? I'm getting desperate. I'm asking him any question I can think and we're getting absolutely nowhere, right? Nothing is sticking. He's obviously not into it. I look down at my clock and we've been there for 50 minutes for an hour-long meeting, right? They're paying me for this. And I'm going, oh, man, I'm going to blow this whole session. We're not going to have anything at the end of this thing. So in desperation, I look at him and I said, okay, tell me about football, right? Of course, he brightens up. He's like, yes. So I go, okay, memorable moment from football. Hit me with it. And he goes, oh yeah, I made this sweet fourth down stop this one time. And I was like, no, no, no. Don't stop, time out. Don't go there, Talk to me about football in a way that's unexpected. Has there been anything in the last couple of years that was strange or unusual or different or something that you didn't see coming? And he goes, yeah, now that you mention it, we got a new coach last year and he had us do this weird thing. He got us all together for football training camp like we do every year. We go off to this camp. We did our drills in the morning, but then in the evening on that first day, he had us all gather together in this big conference room, like a bunch of sweaty football players, right? And they're all gathered together in this big old conference room. The coach breaks them all into groups of 5 and then says, you all have to go around in a circle. And for at least 5 minutes, every guy in the circle has to talk about something hard that they're going through at the time, right? So guys start talking, and at first it's kind of awkward, but by the second or third kid, they're opening up about mental health struggles. They're talking about parental divorce. They're talking about all these things that you would never expect, right? Guys are crying as they're talking about their stories. And then the coach stands up at the end and he tells his story and he's crying. And it's like this whole thing, this like bastion of emotional vulnerability. It's wild. Wouldn't you know it? That season was like the best season their team had ever had in the history of the program. It was like this, miracle Cinderella thing. It was unbelievable. And my student chalked that up to the fact that they all felt so closely bonded after that training camp together that they knew each other when they were on the field, and that helped them play better. And in fact, for my student, those values of emotional connection and vulnerability were central to who he was when I was talking to him. And they are now central to him as a college student, and they're going to be central to him where he goes, right? That was kind of his essay topic, is these values became central to him no matter where he's going to go. And where did he find them? In the most unlikely place you would expect, a football training camp, right? Okay, kind of a neat story. So he tells me this whole thing, and I look at him and I go, dude, where the hell has this been? We've been here an hour. Like, where has this been? What the hell? And he goes, well, you told me not to write about football. Okay, that's my fault, right? I steered him away before digging into the topic. So don't run, investigate. Do exactly the opposite of what the classic advice is. Dig into a cliche and find the unique story within it. And then, hey, if you dig into it and there's nothing there, move on. Fine. That's fine. You let a topic go. But at least dig into it first to see what's there. Okay, I won't read through these. These are just some questions that you can ask. And again, these slides will be available to you. So you'll be able to reference these going forward. All right, I've seen some questions floating in, and to answer, I think it was Anne's question. I think it's literally it's the next slide that will answer your question. But for now, let me just take anything that's floated in. I think there might only be one or two.
We just had a comment at the beginning of your football story that perhaps that you or the student had gone for the Hail Mary. So
I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. Thank you.
So that's it for now. I'll
Great.
give a few more seconds if any others pop in for a minute, but I think we're all itching to hear how students can make their essays unique moving forward.
Yeah, well, hopefully I can provide a satisfactory answer. We'll see. Okay, let's keep moving then. So these are a couple of the issues that I think you're going to see, right? Students are going to come in with pretty extraordinary challenges. And I think it was Anne who asked this question. To your point, you're right. The coronavirus crisis is the most dramatic, certainly of my lifetime and of many people's lifetimes. It can't be ignored, and it shouldn't be ignored. I think there's two main challenges for guidance counselors and admissions counselors and essay tutors like me. The first is that kids are going to come in and they're going to want to talk about stories that are legitimately hard, right? The stories of adversity and hardship that in any other year would more than qualify as a unique story on its own, right? The problem is that so many people are going through such similar hardship that it suddenly becomes a common topic, right? So how do you talk about a really hard thing in a unique way? That's challenge number one. Challenge number two, that's even more complicated, I think, is that students are going to come in and talk about things that frankly, I don't think a lot of them will have fully emotionally processed yet, right? Coronavirus is recent. It's been catastrophic. People have seen loved ones pass away. They've seen lifetimes worth of savings fall apart in months, right? It's just terrible stuff. And it's all very fresh. From an essay writing perspective, the last thing you want is really raw emotional content making its way into a college essay. You can, if you can control it, that's fine. But for a lot of these kids, this is going to be hard to talk about, let alone write about in a clear, compelling, cohesive way. So those are our two challenges, in my opinion, when helping students through this whole process. These are some of the issues specifically that I think you'll see come across your desk. Physical health, not only with COVID-19, but the fact that a lot of medical treatments have been postponed to make room for COVID-19 patients. That's going to be a complication for a lot of students and their family members. So that's something to look out for. Obviously, grief and loss is a major point, financial hardship for obvious reasons. Mental health, again, this cliche is coming up. And if you all haven't been paying attention to the veritable flood of news stories that's been coming in lately about how lockdown and coronavirus are affecting teen mental health lately, I highly, highly encourage you to start looking into it. The New York Times has a great piece. Washington Post has a great piece. It's a big deal, and it's coming very quietly but very fast. So I think a lot of this is going to start coming out over the summertime and into the fall when kids are applying. So look out for that one. hunger that's tied to poverty. There was a study that said that a third of households that have a child under 18 are now food insecure. Food banks are seeing lines longer than they've ever seen in their lives. And then family instability, things like divorce are expected to increase, right? The list goes on and on and on. These are extremely hard topics. These are just some of them that you need to keep an eye out for when kids are coming through. So how to approach them? It's a little bit of a cop-out answer, I'm sorry, but use the same tactic we use with cliches. Instead of saying you can't write about it, or what I think is more tempting, saying that's a really hard story and I don't want to poke and prod at your very vulnerable experience, we kind of have to, right? We kind of have to take this raw content and mold it into something that fits a college essay. And it's hard and it hurts, but that's part of the college application process. So I encourage you to dig into it respectfully and find that unique angle, right? If they're in an emotional place to do this, ask about how they feel with the situation and how they've wrestled with that feeling ever since, how that's changed the way they approach things, right? These are just a few of the questions you can ask. As an example, I recently read a great New York Times piece that was talking about teen mental health, and it profiled a high school senior who's going off to college next year. Now, she had wanted to study communications before coronavirus broke out and didn't really quite know what she wanted to do, but that was her ideal. And then coronavirus happened. Her grandmother, who she's extremely close to, tragically contracted the virus and ultimately ended up passing away in the hospital. And so this student was part of one of those situations that are far too common, those tragic situations that we've all read about, where her grandmother is in the ICU unit and she, the student, is in the hallway behind glass, donned in full PPE gear, with her hand on the window, helpless to help her grandmother as she passes away, right? It's absolutely tragic and heartbreaking. It was this terrible story. So the New York Times journalist, I think correctly said, well, how does this change what you're going to do with college? Are you going to take a gap year? Are you going to still go? What's going to happen? And she said, oh, I'm still going to go. And I still want to study communications. The New York Times journalist said, why? And she said, because now I understand why I wanted to study communications. I am wholly dedicated to fighting the spread of misinformation about coronavirus and all these other diseases that lead to hundreds, if not thousands, of unnecessary deaths every year. That's what I want to use my communications degree for, to fight misinformation as a doctor would fight a virus, right? That's compelling. That's a heck of a story, right? So these are the kind of things. It's just one layer deeper, which is saying this terrible thing happened. What's that going to change for you? How's this going to change what you do? Just going that one level deeper can reveal this incredible content. So I encourage you to work into that. Again, a lot of this is pretty emotionally raw content. So I'm going to go back to those 3 strategies that I talked about earlier. And I'll almost recommend this as a phase 1 for you all, right? So if a student comes to you and they're clearly still very worked up or upset about what's going on, it's very emotionally raw, I would almost suggest this as step 1 to say, look, this is an incredible topic. I think you need to run with it. I encourage you to go home and write about it, or audio journal about it, or do art about it, or make music, or go for a run and think about it, or whatever you do best. Go home and process a little bit and then come back and let's talk, right? I want to hear about this, but I want to give you some time to process first. So that's kind of that 2-step approach. All right. Extremely trite and very short slide. I understand. The fact is, my whole thing with this is we don't know what's going to happen for a lot of these students. We don't really know what the best way to interact with them is, other than embracing, like my student who was the football player, some of those values of emotional vulnerability and connection. Students are willing to be a lot more vulnerable with you about these hard topics if you're vulnerable with them. You're certainly welcome to share how coronavirus has impacted you in a tactful way if it helps a student open up about some of the ways that it's impacted them and their family. I just encourage you not to shy away from asking some hard questions about what's been going on with their experience, some questions that may be uncomfortable to talk about, because those are the very questions that will get a unique story from being buried in the back of their mind onto the front of their mind and ultimately onto their page. Hopefully by now, this is just some miscellaneous resources you can look at. Hopefully by now you understand what I mean when I say that the fundamentals of the college essay process are not different, right? You still have to go through the brainstorming and first draft and revision and final polishing stages, right, to get a good essay. The foundation, the fundamentals are the same. The environment in which they operate is radically different. The topics that they concern are radically different. But to throw out the entire college essay rulebook, I think would be folly. And I certainly encourage you not to do that, but rather to be flexible in the way that you apply it according to some of these strategies and certainly some other strategies that we see coming out of other webinars and great articles going forward. So these are some links for you. I particularly want to point you down to this New York Times op-ed. It's short, it's brief, it's kind of funny. It's an easy read. I found it almost revolutionary, frankly. It's talking about being creative. Some of you have probably heard this advice. I hadn't before I read it. But there's this idea, especially among young people, that creativity is sort of like the artist's situation where you're just walking along, living your life, and then sort of out of nowhere, this like lightning flash of inspiration hits you, and you have to suddenly, drop what you're doing and write it down. It's like inspiration comes out of nowhere. That's kind of not how creativity works at all. You have to sit down and make room for it, right? One of the people interviewed in this, an American photographer, goes, creativity, or he says, inspiration is great. I love inspiration. And that's why I make sure that every morning I'm inspired at 9 a.m. with a cup of coffee. Right? So this is a nice, easy way to say to students, hey, you got to work at it a little bit and the creativity will come, but you got to work. And then a few of these other resources are just good examples of essays for students to use while they're writing for a little bit of inspiration along the way as a help to that process. All right, that is my rambling webinar for you all. If you want to reach out to me, here's my contact info. I would certainly love to be in touch with you, not only about this, but about anything you can share with me too. Like I said, I'm not great at just plowing through webinars like this without anyone talking back. So I would love to hear about your backgrounds and what you have to share. For now though, thank you for hanging with me through this entire thing. And I hope this has been even remotely valuable for you all. So final questions. Hopefully we can have a little bit of a back and forth. And then I'll let you all go.
Thanks, Carter. Yeah, we do have one question right now from David. What do you say to stay away from the political aspects of the situation, i.e. how it was handled, opinions about lockdown versus freedom? Aren't politics and religion not really recommended topics anyway? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's really interesting. The whole reason I think, this is my off the cuff answer, the whole reason I think politics and religion aren't recommended essays are just because they're hard to write about in a way that reflects personal character, right? It's just too easy to get onto a political tirade about how the president or this senator or this governor, is violating freedoms or whatever, what did a terrible response. And so it becomes just like a political blog post rather than a reflection on yourself. That's the reason why they're not good, is because they don't tell you anything about the student other than their political position. That said, this is a wildly political time. Sort of to Anne's point earlier, to ignore politics is kind of like to ignore coronavirus right now. I mean, it's intimately wrapped up in that issue. So yeah, if a student wants to come up with an essay where they talk about the federal response to coronavirus, their interpretation of that, and then more importantly, how that changed their interests and passions and what it makes them want to go do for community service and how it's going to change what they study in college. And all of a sudden they're inspired to be in politics. And that's why they joined the Young Republicans or something. I don't know, like that's very feasible and that's totally allowed. You can craft a good essay out of that. And the same goes for religion. In fact, I just read a wonderful article in The Atlantic that talked about how religion and the coronavirus are highly intertwined. And many, many people think in their faith that coronavirus is certainly tied in with their faith and their religion. Maybe it's a sign from God. So I don't bemoan students for wanting to broach that topic. They simply have to avoid the temptation of just making it all about the issue and not about themselves. If you can flip that balance, I think it's totally fine.
Great, thank you. The last two things we have in our inbox here is from Robbie saying just wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Oh,
and
great.
from Elisa, thanks so much, Carter. Love your passion.
Oh, thank you very much. Although I think there's like 50 people on here, so I'm waiting for 48 other comments to come in complimenting me if you could. No. But seriously, to all of you out there, I know folks probably have to log off. Thank you so much for logging in. This is an unprecedented time, but if there's one thing I picked up on over the course of being an essay coach, it's that we are as much application tutors as we are almost personal counselors in a weird way, especially in a time like this, right? The questions that we ask about these hard topics are oftentimes really useful for students to emotionally process what's going on. That's not just useful for their college app, that's useful for them as people as well. So the fact that so many people logged on to this webinar, that you're taking this so seriously, that you're engaged, gives me a lot of hope that applications this year won't just be this sort of cold industry where we try to get kids into college. Rather, it'll be about the student themselves, their emotional wellness, their holistic wellness, and if they can get into college, right? That's what encourages me.
Thanks so much, Carter. And I'll just add here that Courtney and Maureen both said thank you to you as well.
Great.
So you've got
46
lots
to
of thank
go.
yous coming in.
Great. Yeah.
Um, and Lynn wants to remind you that you did not talk too much. It was great.
Thank you, Lynn. That's what I was waiting
Um,
for. That's the validation I've been needing.
So
Great.
I'll follow suit and say, really, we do thank you so much on behalf of Panakac for sharing this great information, Carter. So it's been our privilege to have you on board here with this.
Great.
And another thank you coming in from Priscilla.
Great.
And
Um,
anything else you want to say, and then I'll close it out with some announcements from Panakac.
Sure thing. The only last thing I'll say is I really do love getting in touch with other people in the area about this stuff, not just from a professional connection standpoint, but frankly, just to learn from you all. So I really do encourage you and ask you to reach out to me by email or phone. I would love to meet any of you and actually see your face and maybe even talk some about some of this stuff.
Great. Thank you so much, Carter. So before we close out, I just want to make a few quick announcements that we will have 2 more webinars for you. In the coming weeks, we'll be sharing pre-recorded webinars on 2 timely topics, I think especially based on what we've heard today. An intro to the benefits, access, and resources for advising students on gap years, and as well as safe recruitment travel. So keep an eye out for more information about those from Panakac. And then if all of these webinars have you itching to share your own insights, we invite you to share your ideas with us for potentially a future webinar. So if you're interested in that, please email profdev@panacac.org. That's short for professional development. So PROFDEV@panacac.org. And with that, we want to thank you once more, Carter, and thank you all to those of you who attended. Have a great weekend, everyone.